In an alien graveyard, a paralyzed alien girl was abandoned by her family. Only one man found her. Ash rained from the bruised sky like the slow decay of forgotten worlds. It clung to the cracked surfaces of shattered monuments, drifted over the broken ribs of once proud towers, and coated the ragged streets with a suffocating film of gray despair. Albert tightened the seals of his filtration mask and stepped deeper into the ruins, his boots crunching through layers of brittle bone and alien debris. The air tasted of rust and regret, even through the filters, each breath a struggle against the slow, poisonous death that permeated this place. This had once been a city, vast, teeming, magnificent. Now it was a graveyard, abandoned by both time and memory. The glyphs etched into the crumbling pillars spoke of a people who had reached beyond the stars, and had fallen all the harder when they lost their grasp. Albert moved cautiously, the old survival instincts burning sharp in his blood. The ruined avenues formed narrow chasms of collapsed stone, perfect places for predators to hide. Scavengers weren't the only ones who haunted the graveyard, not anymore. A soft crack above drew his eyes upward. A skeletal fragment, dislodged by the shrieking wind, tumbled from a high ledge and shattered on the street in front of him, splintering into dust. He muttered a curse and pressed onward, muscles tense under the patched armor that hung from his frame. The tattered remains of a warning beacon crackled somewhere ahead, its dying light pulsing weakly against the thickening dusk. He recognized the signal, radiation pockets nearby, another hazard to dance around. The weight of his scavenger's pack dragged at his shoulders, every step a grim negotiation between necessity and endurance. Supplies were low: oxygen, food, power cells. He was running out of time to find anything worth salvaging, or to get out alive. A static whisper buzzed through his helmet's comms, interference from the decaying tech embedded in the ruins. He ignored it and kept moving, boots stirring the ash into swirling ghost trails behind him. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, not the hollow keening of the wind, not the metallic groan of collapsing structures. Something softer, fragile, like a breath, like a heartbeat struggling against the void. Albert froze, every instinct screaming caution. He slipped behind the rusted shell of what might once have been a transport skimmer and scanned the surroundings, pulse hammering against his ribs. There, amid a spill of rubble and the broken wreckage of a collapsed archway, he caught the faintest flicker of movement. He moved closer, slow and silent. The pistol at his hip was already unholstered, its worn grip steady in his hand. The ruins pressed close around him, oppressive and ancient, as if the very stones were watching. At first he thought it was just another corpse, mummified by exposure. But as he knelt beside the figure, the truth unraveled like a cruel trick of fate. She was alive. Barely. A young woman, alien, but unmistakably sentient. Her skin, a deep, ethereal blue, shimmered faintly under the thin light, veins pulsing dimly with bioluminescence. Long black hair, matted and filthy, spilled over her shoulders, tangling in the dust and ruin. She lay crumpled, motionless, except for the shallow flutter of her breath. Blood, dark, almost iridescent, stained the ground beneath her. Albert's gut twisted. Carefully he leaned closer, scanning her with the battered med scanner strapped to his wrist. Vital signs: weak, injuries, extensive, paralysis, possibly spinal trauma. His gaze caught on something else. Around her neck, hidden beneath torn remnants of alien cloth, a small, gleaming artifact hung, a pendant etched with unfamiliar symbols, pulsing faintly as if alive. Not a scavenger, not a raider, something more. The scanner's warning tone jolted him back, radiation spike approaching. He didn't have long. He cursed under his breath, dragging a hand through his sweat-drenched hair. Logic screamed at him to walk away, to save himself. She was deadweight, a liability. But he couldn't. Not again. A flash of memory tore through him. The screams of his crew as the pirate boarding party tore through their freighter, blood splattering the walls, the captain's voice breaking as he ordered Albert to run. He had run. He had survived. But the weight of that choice had never left him. He looked down at her, this broken, forgotten soul abandoned in the ruins, and felt the old, unbearable guilt ignite like a brand in his chest. He would not abandon her. With grim determination, Albert sheathed his pistol and shrugged off his pack. He pulled out the emergency thermal blanket and wrapped it around her frail body with careful, efficient hands. As he slid an arm under her knees and another around her shoulders, she flinched, a faint automatic reaction. Her violet eyes fluttered open for a second, locking onto his face through the visor. There was no trust there, only raw terror, buried beneath exhaustion too deep to fight. "I've got you," Albert muttered, unsure if she could even understand him. His voice, thick with emotion, sounded alien in the dead silence. He rose with her in his arms, staggering slightly under her weight, or maybe under the crushing certainty that his life had just irrevocably changed. The ruins groaned around him as a gust of wind rattled the broken structures. Somewhere in the distance, something howled, low and mechanical, the guttural snarl of one of the graveyard's surviving defense drones. They hunted scavengers now. Anything that moved. Albert shifted her higher against his chest, feeling the faint heat of her body through the armor plates. No time to hesitate. The nearest shelter he knew of was at least a half-hour's march away, a collapsed maintenance station he'd scouted 2 days before. If he could reach it before the storm worsened, they might have a chance. Might. He gritted his teeth and set off, boots pounding against the cracked pavement, every sense stretched taut. Every minute mattered. The woman stirred once, her head lolling weakly against his shoulder. In a voice so faint he almost missed it, she whispered a single word, a name, or maybe a prayer, before slipping back into unconsciousness. Albert didn't recognize the language, but the sound of it, the fragile hope wrapped inside, struck him harder than any blade. He adjusted his grip, feeling the sting of ash against his exposed skin, the grinding protest of exhausted muscles. Step by step, he carried her forward into the storm, a lone, stubborn flame against the endless dark. Behind him, the graveyard closed in, ancient and pitiless. Ahead, the future waited, broken, dangerous, uncertain. But he didn't look back. He had made his choice, and this time, he would not fail. The world outside screamed and howled, but within the ruined maintenance station, only the faint hum of the battered heater broke the silence. The air inside was heavy, tasting of rust, old oil, and the long-forgotten breath of a dead civilization. Albert worked methodically, his fingers moving with the steady precision of a man who had patched up too many machines, too many bodies, to afford mistakes. He patched holes in the walls with scraps of cloth and old sheet metal scavenged from nearby ruins, sealing out the worst of the ash and poison that clawed at the world beyond. The woman lay still on a makeshift bed fashioned from blankets and the cracked padding of a decommissioned pilot's chair. The faint rise and fall of her chest was the only proof she was still alive. Her skin, a luminous blue, shimmered faintly in the low light, casting an ethereal glow across the wreckage. Albert crouched beside her, adjusting the heater's output. The warmth it provided was pitiful, but it would have to be enough. He studied her again, noting the bruises along her ribs, the raw abrasions at her joints. Her legs lay at unnatural angles, motionless. He hadn't yet dared to check closely. Instinct told him she wasn't just weak. Something deeper was broken inside her. The rational part of his mind whispered that she was a liability, that he should have left her behind like the rest of the scavengers would have. But sitting here, watching her fight for every breath, he knew he would have never forgiven himself if he had. He unstrapped a ration pack, cracked it open, and prepared a straw of nutrient paste. Moving slowly, he pressed it against her lips. For a moment, she didn't react. Then her mouth twitched, a reluctant instinct surfacing from beneath the fog of her mind. She sucked weakly, accepting the sustenance with the detached hunger of the near-dead. Albert wiped a strand of tangled black hair away from her face, careful not to touch her skin more than necessary. Her eyes fluttered open, violet and luminous even in their exhaustion. She tried to speak, a dry rasp barely louder than the hum of the heater. Shelter. He leaned in, lowering his mask so she could see his face more clearly. "You're safe," he said, voice steady. "For now." She stared at him, blinking slowly, confusion clouding her gaze. Her hand twitched against the floor, a small, desperate motion. Albert reached out instinctively but caught himself before making contact. Instead, he set the ration down within her reach and backed away a pace, giving her the space she needed. Trust would have to be earned, not assumed. The woman's lips parted again, struggling for another word. "Who? You?" A ghost of a smile touched his mouth, dry and bitter. "Albert," he said simply. "Just another lost soul." She tried to lift her head, but the effort collapsed her back against the blanket with a pained gasp. Frustration flickered across her bruised face, a flash of raw humanity that cut deeper than any wound. Albert's hands clenched involuntarily. He hated seeing strength trapped inside a broken body. It stirred memories he tried hard not to revisit. Wrecked ships, bleeding crewmen calling for help that never came in time. He forced a breath past the tightness in his chest. "You're safe," he repeated, more for himself than for her. The shelter creaked under the weight of the storm outside. Dust drifted from the ceiling in slow, lazy spirals. Somewhere in the distance, a metallic screech echoed, the sound of a security drone or something worse scavenging through the ruins. Albert checked the seals on the entrance again, bolting the broken hatch with a salvaged steel rod. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would give them warning. Returning to her side, he found her eyes closed again, though her breathing had steadied. Good. Sleep was survival. He settled against the opposite wall, his back to the cold stone. His fingers brushed the worn handle of his pistol, a familiar comfort. Sleep tugged at him, heavy and relentless, but he fought it off. He couldn't afford to be unconscious if something or someone found them. Instead, he watched her. Even in exhaustion, her body betrayed signs of struggle. A tremor in her hands, a faint whimper buried in her breathing. Albert shifted closer, pulling a blanket over her more securely. His knuckles brushed against her arm and she flinched violently. He froze, heart hammering, but after a second, she relaxed, sinking deeper into sleep. Albert exhaled slowly. It wasn't trust yet, but it wasn't rejection either. The hours dragged by. He checked his oxygen reserves, rationed his water, did mental calculations about how long they could last here. Not long. The heater's cells were draining faster than he liked. His food supplies wouldn't stretch more than 4 or 5 days if he shared them, and he would share them. There was no doubt about that anymore. At some point, as the ash storm outside softened to a dull hiss, she stirred again. Her eyes opened, clearer this time. She stared at him in the low light, studying him with a wary, intelligent gaze. Then slowly she rasped another word. "Why?" Albert hesitated. Why? Why not leave her? Why risk his own survival? He didn't have a neat answer. Instead, he said the only truth he could find. "Because you're still alive," he said. "That means something." Her throat worked, as if she wanted to argue. But no words came. She blinked once, slow and heavy, and then her hand, trembling violently, inched across the blanket. It stopped just short of his own. An invitation. A fragile, terrified offering. Albert didn't rush it. He simply laid his own hand down beside hers, close enough that if she wanted, she could close the gap. She didn't. Not yet, but she didn't pull away either. Albert closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself believe, just for a heartbeat, that maybe there was still something worth saving in this broken galaxy. The heater sputtered. The storm outside shrieked and moaned, and within the cracked bones of a dead world, 2 survivors fought not just to live, but to remember what it meant to trust. The shelter's weak heater pulsed a steady hum, its light flickering against the cracked walls. Beyond the thin steel door, the world hissed and whispered under the weight of another gathering storm. But inside, time seemed to slow. Albert crouched by the broken console, sorting the last of his supplies. His every move was deliberate, efficient. He was used to scarcity, used to patching up shattered things and pretending it was enough, but nothing had prepared him for her. Lyrae lay silent on the makeshift bed across the room, her face half turned toward him. The bruises along her throat and collarbone had deepened into angry shades of purple and blue, stark against the pale glow of her skin. Her black hair spilled like a shadow around her, framing the delicate lines of her face. She watched him, not with fear anymore, with something else, something rawer. Albert felt her gaze as keenly as a physical touch, a silent weight pressing against him. He straightened, brushing the dust from his hands, and crossed the room with slow, measured steps. He knelt beside her again, careful to move at an angle where she could see him coming. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. Lyra's mouth twitched in a grim attempt at a smile. Her voice, when it came, was no stronger than a breath. Alive. It was the first time he had heard humor in her voice. Broken and battered, but unmistakably there. A flicker of spirit refusing to die. Albert found himself smiling back, the expression unfamiliar on his weathered face. "That's a start," he said. He reached for the canteen resting nearby and uncapped it. When he offered it to her, their fingers brushed. A whisper of contact, electric and immediate. Lyrae stiffened, muscles jerking instinctively, but she didn't pull away. After a heartbeat, she let her hand linger against his as she grasped the canteen. Albert's breath caught. It would have been easy to pretend the contact meant nothing, that it was just necessity, but he felt the tremor in her hand, the way her fingers curled ever so slightly toward his, the way something unspoken passed between them, fragile, tentative, real. She sipped the water, a few careful swallows, then set the canteen down with clumsy fingers. Her frustration was visible, simmering just beneath the surface. Albert leaned back on his heels, giving her space, but keeping close enough that she wouldn't feel abandoned. "Take it slow," he said. "You're still healing." Lyrae's hands fisted in the blanket. Her jaw tightened. "No," she said, voice cracking. Albert blinked, startled by the sudden vehemence. "I am not healing," she whispered, trembling with anger. "I am broken." The word hit the air like a gunshot. She tried to sit up, her arms straining, but her legs remained limp, unresponsive. The effort dragged a ragged sob from her chest, not of pain, but of pure, blinding rage. Albert moved before he could think. He caught her under the arm, steadying her, feeling the way her body shook with humiliation and fury. "Easy," he murmured, but it wasn't easy, not for her. "Let me go," she gasped, twisting weakly. I can't even..." Her voice broke completely, dissolving into a sound that wasn't quite crying, wasn't quite screaming. Albert held her upright, letting her fight against his strength until her energy bled out, until she sagged against him, breathing hard, her forehead pressed into the crook of his shoulder. He didn't speak. There were no words that wouldn't sound hollow here. Instead, he anchored her, solid and unmoving, absorbing the tremors that racked her small frame. His hand found the back of her head, fingers tangling gently in her tangled hair, offering silent comfort. Slowly, painfully, Lyrae's breathing slowed. The tension in her body drained away, leaving only exhaustion behind. She pulled back a fraction, just enough to meet his eyes. There was no mask between them now, no armor, only the raw, terrible truth of survival, and the fragile, stubborn hope still burning underneath. Albert cupped her face with one rough hand, his thumb brushing across the sharp line of her cheekbone. "We'll fix this," he said, voice low and fierce. "I swear to you." Lyrae closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a glowing path down her cheek. Albert didn't wipe it away. He let her feel it, let her own it. Only when she opened her eyes again did he speak. "I don't know how yet," he admitted, "but I will find a way." For the first time, she didn't argue. She didn't push him away. Instead, she sagged against him, her forehead resting lightly against his collarbone. Trust, fragile, bruised, unfinished, but trust nonetheless. Albert held her there, feeling the small, steady weight of her against him, and made himself another promise. Whatever it took, blood, sweat, metal, sacrifice, he would give it. He would not let this broken world swallow her. Not while he still had breath left in his body. Outside, the storm raged, clawing at the walls with desperate hands. But inside, a small, stubborn piece of something precious had taken root, and Albert Vance would fight like hell to protect it. The storm had finally spent itself, leaving behind a silence that seemed almost heavier than the noise. Fine ash drifted in lazy spirals through the cracks in the walls, settling over the ruins like a shroud. Albert sat cross-legged near the heater, sharpening the edge of a salvage blade more out of habit than necessity. Across the room, Lyrae lay quiet, wrapped in the tattered warmth of the blankets, her breathing slow but steady. The air between them pulsed with unspoken words. She had been awake for some time now, watching him with eyes that no longer held suspicion, only something harder to name, something halfway between fear and hope. Albert set the blade aside and leaned back against the wall, letting his gaze drift toward her without pressing. "You don't have to tell me," he said quietly. "But if you want to, I'll listen." For a moment, he thought she might stay silent. It would have been easier, safer. But then she shifted, a small, deliberate movement that told him she was choosing to speak. "My legs," she began, voice rough and unpracticed, "have never worked." Albert said nothing, just nodded once to show he was listening. She stared at the cracked ceiling, her hands clenching and unclenching in the folds of the blanket. When I was very young, before I could even walk properly, there was an accident, a transport malfunction. They told me the ship's gravity systems failed for a moment. Her lips twisted bitterly. A moment was enough. Albert leaned forward slightly, caught in the raw edges of her voice. My spine, damaged beyond repair by Arvani standards. No pain, but no strength either. They tried treatments, implants, exoskeletal supports. Nothing worked. A long pause. Her breathing grew heavier, as if every word cost her something she didn't have to spare. At first, my family fought for me. Doctors, medics, trials. But as the years passed, the disappointment grew. Albert's fist curled against his knees. She turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes for the first time since she began. On Arvani, strength is sacred, mobility, grace. To be like this, her voice faltered. She gathered herself and forced it out. It is to be considered less, a burden. The heater crackled weakly. Outside, the ruins groaned under the shifting ash. Albert's chest tightened with a slow, searing anger. Not at her, but at the unseen ghosts who had decided her worth based on what her body could or couldn't do. They told me they loved me, Lyrae said, even as they prepared to leave me behind. Her voice didn't break. She didn't cry. But something in her face cracked, a hairline fracture in the careful armor she wore. They brought me here, she whispered, to this graveyard. Said it was a pilgrimage. Said I should rest among the honored dead. Albert swallowed against the bitter taste rising in his throat. They abandoned you, he said, the words harsh in the quiet. Lyrae closed her eyes. Yes. Albert pushed himself to his feet and crossed the room without thinking. He crouched beside her, careful not to touch unless she invited it. She opened her eyes again, and for the first time he saw it clearly, not just pain, but fury. A deep, stubborn defiance that even abandonment hadn't extinguished. They thought leaving me here would be merciful, she said. Better than letting me live a life they believed wasn't worth living. Albert shook his head slowly. They were wrong. Lyra's mouth quirked, the ghost of a bitter smile. You are human. You think differently. Albert chuckled once, dry and humorless. Maybe. But I know cruelty when I see it. Doesn't matter what species you are. They sat there for a long moment, the heater's weak warmth brushing against their skin. Then softly, Lyrae asked, What about you, Albert? Why are you here? The question caught him off guard. He sat back against the wall, exhaling slowly. My crew, he said. We were salvagers, ran supply lines between abandoned sectors, picking through the bones of dead worlds like this one. His voice grew rougher, edges sharp with memory. Pirates caught us off guard. Thought we had tech worth stealing. We didn't. They killed my crew anyway. Left me alive because I happened to be off ship, chasing down a broken relay beacon. He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused, as if seeing them for the first time. I tried to save them, came back too late, found the wreckage, found the blood, and after that, there wasn't much left to do except survive. Lyrae was silent, but her gaze never wavered. Albert gave a small, hollow laugh. Guess that makes us both leftovers. She considered that for a long beat. Not leftovers, she said finally. Survivors. The word settled between them, heavier than the ash coating the world outside. Albert nodded slowly, feeling the weight of it. Yes, he said, survivors. He reached out then, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. His hand hovered above the blanket near hers, open and steady. After a long moment, Lyrae lifted her trembling fingers and set them lightly against his palm. A connection, fragile, new, but real. Albert closed his hand gently around hers. In that broken shelter, surrounded by the dust of the dead, something stubborn, something defiant, bloomed. Hope. And Albert knew with a certainty he rarely allowed himself to feel that he would not let her be abandoned again, not while he still drew breath. The ash was falling heavier that morning, cloaking the broken world in a shifting shroud of gray. Albert stood by the entrance of the shelter, tightening the straps of his battered pack, feeling the weight of what he was about to do settle heavily on his shoulders. Every instinct screamed at him to stay, to protect what little he had managed to save. But he couldn't help her if he stayed. He turned back toward the small interior where Lyrae slept fitfully beneath a mound of salvaged blankets. Her breathing was shallow but even, her fragile frame almost lost in the tangled bedding. Albert moved quietly, checking the few meager supplies he'd left her. 2 canisters of clean water, several packets of preserved food, an old solar heater that he had coaxed back into sputtering life. It wasn't enough. It would never feel like enough. He crouched beside her for a long moment, studying her face, the faint glow of her veins under her silvery skin, the delicate frown that never seemed to leave her brow, even in sleep. "I'll come back," he murmured under his breath, more a vow than a hope. "I swear it." He rose and crossed to the door, reinforcing the metal barricade he had welded days ago. Extra braces, alarm wires strung through the rubble, booby traps that would slow, if not stop, any scavengers who might stumble across her while he was gone. It was all crude, temporary, but it was the best he could do. Before leaving, he scribbled a rough note on a scrap of polymer sheet and set it beside her. "Stay safe. Trust yourself. I'll return." He lingered in the doorway longer than he should have, heart tearing itself in two. Then he turned and stepped out into the ash-stained morning. The air was colder today, the toxic winds sharper against his skin. He pulled his hood low and adjusted the worn filter mask over his face, the familiar rasp of recycled air filling his ears. Deep Market lay eastward, buried beneath the ruins, a place of broken deals and broken dreams, a place where humanity's worst instincts thrived. Albert's boots crunched against shattered concrete as he walked, each step carrying him further from safety and deeper into danger. His mind raced ahead, calculating the risks. Deep Market was no open bazaar. It was a festering wound in the world, hidden beneath layers of dead civilizations. Only the desperate went there. Only the damned stayed. He clutched the memory of Lyrae to him like a talisman, the image of her struggling to sit up, her hands trembling, but her eyes fierce with life. She deserved a chance, a future, a life where she wasn't trapped in a broken body on a dying world. Albert's jaw tightened. He didn't know if he could find what she needed. He didn't know if he could afford it or survive the trying. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't come back empty-handed. He pushed forward, muscles burning with effort. The landscape grew harsher the farther he went. Collapsed buildings stacked atop one another, jagged spires of rusted metal reaching toward the sky like the broken bones of forgotten giants. By nightfall, he reached the first boundary markers, rusted poles hung with scraps of blood-stained cloth, warning off the unwary. Deep Market was close. Albert paused, crouching low behind the remnants of a shattered archway. He pulled a dented canteen from his pack, sipping the stale water sparingly. He tightened the straps across his chest, double-checked the knife sheathed at his belt. This wasn't just a salvage run. This was war, a quiet personal war, against indifference, against a universe that threw away those it deemed useless. He let the silence settle over him, steadying his breath, calming the frantic pounding of his heart. "I'm coming for you," he whispered into the ash-choked night. Then he rose, squared his shoulders, and walked into the dark, toward Deep Market, toward the deal that could either save them or destroy him. The closer Albert got to Deep Market, the more the world seemed to rot around him. The ruins thickened into tangled masses of broken stone and twisted metal. The air grew heavier, filled with a metallic tang that clung to his tongue like blood. Even the light dimmed, smothered under layers of ash and smog. He kept moving, boots crunching over debris, every muscle in his body taut with unease. Deep Market was not a place of welcome. It was a graveyard of broken promises, a place where people came to trade away the last pieces of their souls for a sliver of survival. Albert adjusted the mask over his face, the recycled air hissing against his ears. His mind raced ahead of him, painting scenarios, warnings, failures. Was he doing the right thing? Leaving Lyrae alone in that crumbling shelter? Trusting the market to offer salvation instead of betrayal? He paused behind the jagged remains of an old transport vehicle, crouching low, letting the oppressive silence fold over him. The truth gnawed at him. He could turn back now. Forget this madness. Accept the world as it was. A cold, indifferent place where the weak were abandoned and the strong survived by not caring. He clenched his fists against his knees, bowing his head. The memory of Lyrae's face rose unbidden, the defiance burning in her bruised, exhausted eyes, the tentative way she had smiled at him, fragile and rare as a new blossom in the ash. Number. He could not abandon her, he would not. He stood slowly, squaring his shoulders. Some battles were worth fighting, even if you didn't know how to win. Albert pressed forward, weaving through the wreckage toward the hidden entrance he had heard whispers of, an old cargo elevator shaft converted into a pathway to the underworld. When he found it, guarded by two towering mercenaries patched together with cybernetics and rage, he didn't hesitate. He kept his hands where they could see them, moving slow, deliberate. One of the mercs, a brute with a half-melted face, grunted and tilted his head toward the shaft. "You looking to trade, scavenger?" Albert nodded once. The other guard smirked, stepping aside. "Good. Hope you brought something worth bleeding for." The shaft groaned and shuddered as Albert descended, the ancient lift cage rattling against its tracks. The darkness swallowed him whole, and for a long moment, it felt as if he was falling not through space but through time, into a place where the old rules no longer mattered. When the lift screeched to a halt, deep market unfurled before him like a wound ripped open. Stalls fashioned from scavenged ship parts and rotting cargo crates crowded the narrow tunnels. Fires burned low in rusted oil drums, casting flickering shadows on the faces of traders, thieves, and the desperate. Vendors hawked wares that should not have existed, limbs in tanks of gel, memory drives blackened with forbidden data, weapons whose very designs were outlawed by every known law. Albert kept his head down, moving with purpose, ignoring the stares and the whispered offers that hissed from every shadow. He found the prosthetics dealers near the heart of the market, a wide stall marked by a neon sign that flickered between rebuild and debt. Behind the counter sat a man, or what remained of one. His face was a patchwork of organic flesh and mechanical implants, his eyes gleaming cold and metallic. Albert approached, setting his battered pack on the counter. "I need legs," he said simply. The dealer laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Don't we all?" Albert said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them like a blade. Finally, the dealer leaned forward, studying him. "Human," he said slowly. "You want good legs, durable, combat grade, adaptable." Albert nodded once. The dealer stroked the scrap metal plates welded to his chin. "Payment?" Albert reached into his pack and laid a cracked credit stick on the counter. It wasn't much, but it was everything he had. The dealer barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "Not enough." Albert felt the cold fist of fear tighten in his gut. "Then what?" he asked. The dealer smiled, thin and sharp. "A job." He slid a data chip across the counter with a long mechanical finger. "There's a shipment, biotech, stolen from Dominion Labs. High value, dangerous to move. I need it retrieved, quietly." Albert picked up the chip, turning it between his fingers. "If I refuse?" The dealer shrugged. "Then you walk out empty-handed, and your crippled little girl keeps crawling in the dirt until the scavengers find her." The words hit like a hammer blow. Albert closed his eyes for a moment. He could almost hear Lyrie's voice. Quiet, steady, stubborn beyond all reason. "Stay alive. Stay strong." He opened his eyes again, meeting the dealer's gaze without flinching. "I'll do it," he said. The dealer grinned wider. "Good, don't die too quickly. I don't like losing free labor." Albert pocketed the chip, turned on his heel, and disappeared into the crowd. The market swallowed him whole. And somewhere beyond the ruins, in a broken shelter beneath a broken sky, a girl waited. Albert tightened his grip on the data chip. Whatever it cost, he would bring her hope. He would bring her back her future, even if it broke him. The ruins swallowed Albert whole. He ran through broken alleys and crumbling corridors, the stolen case clutched against his chest like a lifeline. Plasma bolts sizzled past him, carving smoking gouges in the stone. Behind him, the enforcer shouted, boots hammering against the cracked concrete. His shoulder burned where a bolt had grazed him earlier, the sleeve of his jacket torn and bloodied. Every breath rasped painfully in his throat. Every step jarred the wound deeper. But he didn't stop, couldn't. The stolen biotech was heavy in his arms, a precious, dangerous promise. Without it, there would be no future for Lyrie. Without it, all of this, all the blood, all the betrayal, meant nothing. Albert ducked into a collapsed structure, pressing himself against the shadowed wall as a squad of enforcers swept past. He could hear the mechanical whine of their sensors scanning the air, feel the hum of their weapons charging. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself still. Minutes dragged by. Sweat trickled down his spine. His injured arm throbbed with every heartbeat, the blood loss beginning to sap his strength. When the sounds of pursuit finally faded, he moved again, slow, cautious. Every step cost him. He stumbled more than once, vision graying at the edges. His legs felt like lead, his breath shallow and ragged. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that he couldn't make it, that he should lie down, let the darkness take him. He ignored it. He thought of Leroy, her hands trembling as she tried to sit up, the fierce pride burning in her violet eyes despite the pain. He thought of the promise he had made her. "I'll come back," he had said. He would not break that promise. Not now. Not ever. He staggered through the ruins, following the half-remembered pathways back toward the hidden entrance of the deep market. The world blurred around him, shapes melting into one another, the ground tilting and shifting under his feet. At some point he fell. The case slipped from his grasp, clattering against the stone. Albert lay there for a moment, gasping, his body refusing to obey. The cold seeped into his bones. His blood stained the ground beneath him, dark and sluggish. He could stay down, close his eyes, let it end. Number with a snarl of pure will, he forced himself upright. One hand clutched the case, the other pressed against the open wound at his side. One step, then another. The world narrowed to nothing but the next footfall, the next breath, the next heartbeat. Somehow, he didn't know how, he reached the market's edge. The guards barely glanced at him as he stumbled past, blood-slick and trembling, the stolen prize still clutched in his hands. When he reached the croupier's stall, he slammed the case down onto the counter with a ragged grunt, collapsing against it for support. The croupier looked up, blinking slowly, a lazy grin spreading across his grotesque face. "Still breathing," he said, almost impressed. "Didn't think you had it in you." Albert said nothing. He didn't have the strength. The dealer opened the case, checked the contents quickly, then nodded in satisfaction. "A deal's a deal," he said. He rummaged beneath the counter and pulled out a wrapped bundle. It landed heavily beside the case, wrapped in oil-stained cloth. Albert stared at it, vision swimming. The prosthetics, rugged, built for survival, engineered for strength rather than beauty. Perfect for her. The croupier leaned closer, sneering. "Hope she's worth it," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "Hope she don't just end up another corpse in this graveyard." Albert's hand twitched toward the knife at his belt. For a heartbeat, he almost drew it, almost spilled blood right there across the counter, but then he saw Leroy's face again. Her smile, her stubborn will. He swallowed the rage down like poison. Without a word, he grabbed the bundle, slinging it over his good shoulder. The world tilted dangerously as he turned away, the edges of his vision blurring to black. He stumbled back toward the lift shaft, the prosthetics dragging at him like anchors. The ride up was a nightmare of flickering lights and the groaning protest of ancient machinery. When the elevator finally shuddered to a halt at the surface, Albert nearly collapsed onto the cracked stone. He didn't stop. Couldn't stop. He wrapped his fingers tighter around the bundle and set off toward the shelter, dragging himself through the ruined city like a ghost. Hours blurred into one another. The sky shifted from dark gray to a lighter shade, signaling the approach of morning. Ash drifted down in lazy spirals, coating him in a thin, cold shroud. By the time he reached the outskirts of the shelter, Albert was barely conscious. The door loomed ahead, a battered slab of metal half buried in rubble. He fumbled with the latch, nearly dropping the bundle in the process. The hatch groaned open. Warmth spilled out, the faint flickering light of the solar heater casting long shadows across the floor. And there she was, Lyrie, alive, waiting. Her eyes widened as she saw him, his battered body. The blood caked across his clothes, the way he barely managed to stay upright. "Albert," she gasped, scrambling toward him. He smiled, small, broken, but real. "Told you," he rasped. "Told you I'd come back." Then the world tilted sideways and he collapsed into darkness. Albert woke to the dim flicker of the shelter's broken solar lamp, its light casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked floor. His entire body ached. Every breath felt like pulling broken glass into his lungs. Pain throbbed through his shoulder, down his spine, deep into his bones. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then he felt it. A small, trembling hand curled around his own. Warm. Alive. He turned his head slowly, vision swimming. Leary sat beside him, her face pale and tight with worry. Her free hand hovered uncertainly over his chest, as if afraid he might vanish if she let go. "You're awake," she whispered, voice cracking. Albert swallowed hard, wincing at the sharp ache in his throat. "Wasn't planning to check out yet," he rasped. Relief flooded her face, softening her tense features. You scared me, she said, and there was a rawness in her voice that twisted something deep inside him. He squeezed her hand weakly. Sorry, he murmured. Larry shook her head fiercely, blinking back tears. She had cleaned him while he was unconscious. He could smell the faint tang of antiseptic, feel the rough bandages wrapped around his wounds. She had done what she could with what little they had. It wasn't enough, not by any real medical standard, but it had saved him. You're stronger than you think, she whispered. Albert smiled, crooked, painful, but real. You're one to talk. He tried to sit up. Pain lanced through his ribs, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through it. Leary helped him, her hands gentle but firm. When he was upright, she reached behind her and pulled something into view, a rough, oil-stained bundle carefully wrapped in cloth. The prosthetics. Albert's heart kicked hard against his ribs. I found these, Larry said, voice trembling slightly. You brought them back. He nodded slowly. They're yours, he said, forcing the words past the tightness in his throat. Always were. Her hands shook as she unwrapped the bundle, revealing the heavy utilitarian legs beneath. They weren't beautiful, no sleek curves, no polished surfaces, but they were strong, reliable. A chance. Albert watched her trace her fingers over the metal, wonder and fear warring across her face. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered. You can, he said quietly, and you won't have to do it alone. Together they worked. Albert showed her how the attachment points would link into the neural ports near the base of her spine. An old surgical site, faintly scarred, a relic of the medics who had tried and failed to save her when she was a child. The process was slow, painstaking. Every movement sent new jolts of pain through his battered body, but he ignored it. This wasn't about him. It was about her. He steadied the first prosthetic as she guided the connector into place. The mechanism clicked softly, the internal systems whirring as they synced with her nervous system. Larry gasped, her body jerking as sensation bloomed through circuits long dormant. It's okay, Albert said, gripping her hand. You're okay. She nodded, biting her lip hard enough to draw blood. The second leg went faster, though the strain etched deep lines into her face. When it was done, she sat there for a moment, staring down at the crude metal limbs now attached to her frail body. Silent, terrified, hopeful. Albert knelt in front of her, careful not to crowd her. You don't have to rush, he said. One breath at a time. Leary nodded. She planted her hands on the floor, adjusted her weight slowly, experimentally. The servos in the prosthetics hissed softly, compensating for her movements. Her first attempt to rise ended in a painful collapse. Albert caught her before she hit the ground, arms wrapping around her instinctively. It's okay, he murmured. Try again. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, gritted her teeth, tried again. This time she got halfway up before her legs buckled. Albert steadied her, feeling the fine tremors racing through her body. I'm here, he said, lean on me. And she did. Slowly trembling, she rose to her feet. The legs groaned under the strain, adjusting awkwardly to her weight. Leary swayed dangerously, gripping Albert's arm like a lifeline. Her breathing was shallow and fast, panic hovering just beneath the surface. You're doing it, he said quietly, awe threading his voice. I'm not, she whispered, tears streaming freely now. I'm barely standing. Albert smiled, the kind of smile that had weathered storms and loss and loneliness. And yet, here you are. She looked at him then, really looked, and something shifted in her expression. Hope, fury, determination, and love. Leary took a deep, shuddering breath and took a step. It was small, it was awkward, it was perfect. Albert tightened his grip on her waist, supporting her as she stumbled into a second step. Then a third. Each movement was a battle, a war between muscle memory and mechanical systems, between fear and fierce, stubborn will. But she kept moving, one trembling step after another, until she stood there, breathing hard, her cheeks wet with tears but her back straight, her chin high. Albert laughed, a choked, joyful sound, and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. You did it, he whispered into her hair. She clung to him, her fingers twisting into the fabric of his jacket. You made it possible, she breathed. He pulled back just enough to see her face. I just gave you the tools, he said. The rest, that was all you. Leary smiled then, a real smile, wide and unguarded, lighting up her face in a way that stole the breath from his lungs. She cupped his face in her hands, fingers brushing against the rough stubble of his jaw. And then, without hesitation, she kissed him. It was soft, tentative at first, then deeper, fiercer, a kiss full of all the fear, gratitude, and desperate, overwhelming love that words could never contain. When they broke apart, Albert pressed his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling. "I love you," he said simply, the words falling from him as natural as breathing. Lyra closed her eyes, her smile trembling but radiant. "I love you too." The world outside their broken shelter remained ruined, ash-choked, hostile. But inside, where their hearts beat in unison, a new world was being built. One step at a time, together, always together. The days that followed unfolded like a fragile dream, unsteady, imperfect, yet impossibly precious. Lyra walked now, not gracefully, not yet. But she moved through the shattered shelter with a stubborn determination that made Albert's chest ache with pride every time he looked at her. Each morning she practiced, leaning on walls, on makeshift crutches Albert scavenged and built. Each evening she pushed herself further until the awkward, hesitant steps became strides of fierce willpower. Albert stayed close, always ready to catch her if she stumbled. But more often than not, he simply watched. Watched her laugh when she almost fell. Watched her curse in 3 different languages when the prosthetics locked up. Watched her live. He repaired the shelter in between, tending to her training. Reinforced the outer doors, rigged better filters for the air, expanded the storage rooms. He built a new cot beside hers, though most nights he found himself falling asleep with her hand tucked in his, their breaths synchronized in the quiet darkness. They were no longer just surviving. They were building something, a life. One evening, as the dying light painted the ruins in muted gold, Lyra limped to the entrance of the shelter and stood there, staring out over the wasteland. Albert watched her from a few paces back, giving her space, knowing she needed this moment. The wind tugged at her hair, sending loose strands dancing across her face. The ash that drifted down from the sky caught the last rays of sunlight, making it seem for a moment as if stars were falling all around her. She turned to him, her violet eyes luminous. "I never thought I'd stand here again," she said softly. Albert crossed the distance between them, his boots crunching softly over the dust. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "You fought for it," he said simply. Lyra smiled, a small, fierce thing. "So did you." She leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest. They stood there, wrapped in each other, while the ruins of a dead world stretched out around them. Later that night, when the fires had burned low and the cold began to creep back in, Albert lay beside her under the patched blankets, tracing slow circles over the back of her hand with his thumb. "Lyra," he murmured, voice roughened by exhaustion and emotion. She shifted closer, her body fitting against his as naturally as breathing. "Hmm?" He hesitated, words thick in his throat. "I don't want to just survive anymore," he said. "Not without you." She tilted her head back to look at him, her eyes soft and shining. "You won't have to." Albert let out a shaky breath, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I want more," he whispered against her skin. "A life, a future, with you." Lyra smiled, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "You already have me," she said, voice barely a whisper. "Always." She cupped his face between her hands, pulling him down into a kiss. It wasn't desperate this time. It wasn't rushed. It was slow, deep. A binding of souls more than bodies, a promise, a vow. When they pulled apart, Albert pressed their foreheads together, breathing her in. "I love you," he said again, as if the words themselves could anchor him. "I love you too," she whispered back. "More than this broken world, more than the stars." The days turned into weeks. Together they scavenged better supplies. Together they built stronger walls, planted seeds salvaged from old rations. Together they lived. And then one morning, as they worked side by side repairing the long-range transmitter salvaged from the market, the impossible happened. The receiver crackled to life. A faint, broken signal stuttered through the static. "Colony, survivors, Sector 14, requesting contact." Albert froze, staring at the console. Lyra's hand found his without hesitation, gripping tight. Hope flared between them, bright and blinding. They weren't alone. Beyond the wastelands, beyond the ruins, there were others. A future waiting for them. Albert turned to her, seeing the same fierce, stubborn hope shining back at him. "Together?" he asked. his voice rough. "Always," she answered, without missing a beat. He laughed, pulling her close, spinning her around until she laughed too, the sound pure and clear and alive. Outside, the wind stirred the ash into dancing patterns across the dead city, but within their small, stubborn shelter, something stronger than ruin had taken root. Hope, love, a new beginning. And as they stood there, holding each other against the broken world, they knew, whatever lay ahead, whatever battles still waited beyond the horizon, they would face it, hand in hand, heart to heart, together, forever. The new colony was nothing like the shining cities of the old worlds. It was rough, unfinished, buildings cobbled together from salvaged metal and shattered stone, solar panels patched and flickering, roads little more than flattened dirt. But to Albert and Leary, it was beautiful. It was life. They arrived at dusk, guided by the crackling signal they had chased across the ruins, exhausted, dirty, alive. The colonists welcomed them cautiously at first. Strangers were a risk in a place where every resource mattered. But Leary's smile, radiant despite the battered prosthetic supporting her steps, and Albert's steady, unyielding presence won them over. They were given a small prefab shelter at the edge of the colony, bare walls, a sagging roof, a rickety door. To Albert and Leary, it was a palace. Together they made it a home. They patched the leaks, planted salvaged seeds in cracked pots, hung a battered scrap of cloth, stitched with stars and constellations Leary remembered from her childhood, over the doorway. Each morning they worked with the others, repairing solar fields, expanding greenhouses, salvaging what could be saved from the endless dead cities beyond the colony's perimeter. Each night, they returned to their tiny home, bone-tired, but full in a way neither had thought possible. Leary grew stronger every day. Her prosthetic legs no longer buckled under her weight. She moved through the colony with a quiet confidence that turned heads. Sometimes she laughed when she caught Albert watching her, a look of pure wonder on his face. "You act like I'm some kind of miracle," she teased one evening, wiping grease from her hands after repairing a broken irrigation line. Albert just smiled, brushing a smudge from her cheek with his thumb. "You are," he said simply. And she was. Not just because she walked, but because she lived, because she loved, because after everything, the pain, the betrayal, the loneliness, she had chosen to keep moving forward. So had he. Some nights, when the air was clear and the stars broke through the dusty skies, they sat together outside their little home, a worn blanket wrapped around their shoulders. Albert would point out constellations, half-remembered from old navigation charts, while Leary leaned against him, listening. It wasn't perfect. The world was still broken. The scars they carried would never fully fade. But here, in this rough new world they had built with their own hands, surrounded by survivors who understood what it meant to fight for every breath, they had found something neither had dared to dream of. A place to belong, a place to heal, a future. One evening, as the first seedlings in their makeshift garden pushed stubbornly through the cracked soil, Albert turned to Leary and caught her smiling down at the green shoots. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice low, warm. Leary looked up at him, her violet eyes shining. "That we survived," she said. "That we won." Albert laughed softly, pulling her closer. "Yeah," he said, "we did." And as the stars wheeled overhead and the wind whispered through the new life they had planted, they held each other tightly, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it the same way they had survived everything before. Together, always together. The night was soft and still. The colony settled into its usual hush after a long day of work. Albert sat outside their shelter, a battered mug of warm synth coffee cradled in his hands. The stars above were faint, barely visible through the lingering haze, but he didn't care. He was content. Leary approached quietly, the prosthetic silent against the packed earth. She carried something small, hidden behind her back. Albert tilted his head, smiling at her. "You're up to something," he said. She grinned, a secretive, mischievous smile that made her look years younger. "Close your eyes," she said. He chuckled, but obeyed, setting his mug down and folding his hands in his lap. He felt her move closer, the faint whisper of her breath against his skin. "Okay," she whispered. "Open them." Albert opened his eyes and froze. In her hands, she held a small, rough pendant made from scavenged wire and a piece of polished glass. Crude, imperfect, beautiful. The glass caught the faint light of the stars, refracting it into soft, shimmering colors. "It's a star," Lyra said shyly, her cheeks flushing a delicate silver pink. "I found the glass in the ruins. I thought, maybe you could carry a piece of the sky with you, since you gave me the chance to walk under it again." Albert stared at the gift, throat tightening painfully. It wasn't just a pendant. It was a piece of everything they had fought for, everything they had bled for, everything they had built. He took it from her hands with a gentleness he rarely showed, running his thumb over the rough edges. "Lyra," he said, voice thick. "This is—" She looked down, suddenly uncertain. "I know it's not much," she mumbled. "But Albert cut her off by pulling her into a fierce hug, crushing her against his chest. "It's perfect," he whispered into her hair. She laughed, muffled against him, and hugged him back just as tightly. When they pulled apart, Albert slipped the pendant over his head, letting it settle against his chest. It wasn't heavy. It felt like hope. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her skin. "Thank you," he said. Lyra smiled up at him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Thank you," she replied, "for everything." They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in the soft, flickering starlight, the broken world forgotten. Not survivors anymore, not lost. Home, in each other, always.